Hey everyone, and welcome to the tutorial series for the NPC Manager system. In this video, we'll be taking a look at the NPC Dialogue and the player interactions. Most of the video will be spent looking at how the NPC Dialogue system works, some of the settings, and really understanding the design so you can go ahead and add your own dialogue and have the NPCs work the way you want them to. So first things first, let's go ahead and jump into Unreal and see exactly what the dialogue system is. And if you follow from the last video, we left off our little NPC that is going into the bounding box and then going home. Let's go ahead and modify that profile. So go ahead and open profile tutorial here. And we have only one task, which is use location. Let's go ahead and change that to standard task. Roam in nearby bounds, and let's have this guy roam for 300 seconds. The point is long enough for us to be able to watch the interactions. We don't need locations at all. We just need them to go to nearby bounds. We also want to go back to the NPC tutorial, and we'll change some things here. Go to the NPC controller. Go to debug, and we're going to disable this. We don't want to debug anything here. And we want to open the social options here. And we want to increase the percent chance to start a conversation, an interaction, to 1. 1 is 100%, basically. And we want to make sure that this option can interact with other NPCs is selected. We're going to go ahead and click compile and save. And one more thing, we want to make this bounding box fairly small. So let's make it something like 6 by 6. And the reason for that is because the way that the NPCs interact is they're going to be going about their business, roaming around in the world, following a path. And when two NPCs overlap, and they're going to overlap by this volume here, then and only then will they decide if they can interact. So if we have a big area here, we're going to be waiting a long time for the NPCs to randomly run into each other. So we make the area very small. We're basically forcing the NPCs to be really close together so we can watch the interactions happen. Another thing is we're going to come here and click on the interaction trigger, and I want to scale this. Press R to change it, and we're going to scale it up. And again, the only reason I'm doing this is to make sure that the NPCs interact easily. Normally, I would probably not do this for a real game because you don't want your NPCs always talking. But for demonstration purposes, we want this big so they can interact as easily as possible. And the last thing we'll do is we're going to duplicate this guy. And we're going to change a setting here just to differentiate them. NPC Tutorial 2, we'll click on the mesh, and we'll change the material right here under element 0. Instead of blue, let's give him a green, just so we can know which one is which. And then click on NPC Controller, and under Voice ID, we're here on Social Options. We're going to select Male 02. All of this will make sense in just a second. Just do that for now. Click on save. And now let's go ahead and click play. And we're going to go here on current camera location. Okay. How goes it?
I'm fine.
How is everyone?
They're all doing fine.
Good to hear.
I'll see you around.
Be seeing you. There you go. That is one random conversation, and then they're going to go around roaming, and then once they run into each other, they start again. I'm fine.
How's your family doing?
Son got the flu last week.
I'm sorry to hear. I hope he gets better soon.
Goodbye.
Bye then.
All right. So very, very lucky that we got that. A couple of things, if you were paying attention. One, notice that the conversation was slightly different each time. They did not repeat the exact same line. And also notice that the NPCs were doing different animations when they were listening versus when they were talking. So this system allows you to create basically random conversations that the NPCs can have with a variety of answers that you can add, the ability to add your own voice lines, and obviously more than one voice actor. As you can see that we have two different voice actors, male 01 and male 02. They all have read the exact same lines, and you can give each NPC their specific voice. So that gives you a huge amount of flexibility. So what are some of the options that we have for our social interactions? We already looked at some of those, but let's take a quick look. The first thing is, do you want them to even interact with other NPCs? You may or may not want specific NPCs to do that, so you have the option there. You also have interaction tags, and just like with the stations, you can decide which NPCs can talk to which NPCs. So NPCs will only talk to other NPCs if they have at least one matching tag. So by default, they all have the tag NPC, so they're all going to talk to each other. But if I were to change this guy and put a different tag, when they get close to each other and they try to communicate, they'll see that they don't have matching tags. They won't talk to each other. So that's yet another way that you can have perhaps different factions of NPCs or people in different towns that don't want to talk to each other, even if they're around the world. You can add as many tags as you want, and as long as one tag between those two NPCs matches, they'll be able to talk. Otherwise, they will not talk. You have the percent chance of starting a conversation. Normally, I wouldn't recommend 100%. That's one. 25% or 50%, play around with those numbers, whatever feels natural. You want these events to be spontaneous and the player to see these NPCs talking in the world, but you probably don't want everybody talking all the time, right? Then you have this data table here, dialogue data table, which we will see in just a second. I recommend you stick to one data table. Really weird things happen, and you can break the system if two NPCs have different data tables. So it is up to you to make sure that they are using the same data table. If you're making a really big game and you have all kinds of dialogue, you may want to have specific dialogue tables per level or per town or something. In other words, make it easy for yourself to ensure that every time two NPCs are talking, they're going to have the exact same data table. Then here, you'll notice that we have greetings and goodbyes subcategories. And again, all of this will make sense in just a second once we look at the data itself. But you can specify which topics or categories NPCs can talk about. So obviously, in this case, we have a very generic conversation about how's your family. But in your world, you're going to create as many different topics and categories and subcategories as you want, and based on the categories that each NPC has, they'll be able to have a conversation about those topics. So maybe NPCs in one town have different categories versus NPCs in another town, and that way when your player goes to one town, he'll hear different conversations versus going to a different town, right? All of that is controlled by telling the NPCs which categories or subcategories they'll have on the greetings, on the goodbyes, and then on the allowed dialogue, which is basically kind of the meat of the system here. These are the lines that you'll actually add. And by default, all NPCs have generic subcategory for greeting, a generic subcategory for goodbye, and this is just the example that I include, category family, subcategory generic. And then finally, you'll have your voice ID, and this is just a tag. By the way, this has to match a tag in the data table. And by default, I have male 01, which is, surprise, surprise, myself, which is why I sound so bad. I'm a terrible voice actor, but I did it myself just to showcase the system. And male 02 is actually a community member which is way better than me at doing this stuff. So he was gracious enough to volunteer and provide his voice so you all can see how things work. And finally, you have an interaction cooldown, and this is in seconds. And if you hover over, you'll see exactly what it is. Basically, once an NPC finishes an interaction, there's going to be a cooldown period when he cannot have another conversation. And that is to prevent an NPC from finishing a conversation and immediately starting another one. We want to give the NPCs a little breather and give them the opportunity to kind of spread around, because what happens is, by chance, you may have another NPC walk right as these two guys are finishing and immediately start another conversation, and that doesn't seem natural. Obviously, you could make this 0 if you wanted, or 0.5 seconds, right? If you really want to disable it, or you can make this cooldown way bigger. So again, go ahead and play with these values until you get the settings that you want. All right. So now that we see how things work generically, I want to take a second to go back to our slides here. And I know this is probably not what you were expecting, but I think this is important. Let me make this bigger here. And I want to explain the design of the system, because only when you understand how things are designed, you'll be able to add your dialogue to work exactly how you want. So I have a separate slide here where I explain exactly how the dialogue system works. And think about the dialogue as having 3 different phases. And these are these big squares here. The first phase of a conversation is the greeting. You're always going to greet each other. Then you'll have the actual conversation, whatever topic that is, and then you'll have a goodbye. And within each individual phase, what you have is you have different types of lines or dialogue. You have initial, which is a type initial, which is going to be the initial greeting or initial conversation or initial goodbye. And in this example, we have something like, how are you? Or hello. Then you have a type response, which is going to be something like, I'm fine, or I've been better. And then we have another category, which is called a follow-up, which I'll talk in just a second. So the idea here is that you want to add as many random lines as you want per phase, per type. So in this case, we have how are you and hello are all from greeting and are all initial. And we have I'm fine and I've been better as part of the greeting category, but the type response. So what happens is an NPC will start a conversation and say, okay, we are now at the greeting stage. I'm going to pick a random line from the same category and subcategory on the type initial. And the NPC will say, how are you? And then it'll pass along this message to the other NPC, which will then say, now I need to send a response that matches the same stage and the same subcategories, and it will pick a random response from that category. So it can either respond with I'm fine or I've been better. So this is how you add randomness. You could have 20 different initials here and 20 different responses, and as long as they make sense and they're fairly generic, you'll hear very different conversations every single time. When this is done, you go into the next phase, which is actually what we call the conversation here, kind of the main topics. And this is, in the case of the demo, family and generic, category family. So then the NPC will then say, okay, now we're at this stage, let's do initial, and pick a random line from this type initial, how's everyone? And then this NPC will again pick a random line from the response category, and they'll say they're fine, or they'll say son got the flu. However, there's a little extra thing here. Notice that we have a follow-up. There is a way that you can specify a response to a response or a follow-up line based on a specific line. Because you wouldn't want the NPC to say, how's everybody? Son got the flu last week. And then for this NPC to respond, good to hear, right? That's probably not a very nice thing. So you can specify a follow-up line. And you heard that in the example. The first time this guy said they are doing fine, then the NPC responded, good to hear. Then on the second time, and again, by chance, He responded, son got the flu last week. And then we send the follow-up with a special ID that said, now you should respond with, I'm sorry to hear, I hope he gets better soon. Then finally, when you're done here, then you move on to the goodbyes, and it's exactly the same as greeting. Pick a random one, pick a random response, conversation ends, and then the cooldown begins, and then the NPCs continue roaming around and doing their thing. And then when two NPCs yet again meet each other, the whole process starts again. So hopefully this makes sense, and if you want to pause the video, you can kind of take a screen grab of this, but hopefully this is fairly simple to understand. And if I show you guys the actual data table, or a spreadsheet rather, and I drag it to my screen here, you'll see that this is exactly what we just talked about. I'm going to put a link to this Google Docs for you guys in this video. You are free to save it or download it yourself. And this is the exact same spreadsheet that I used for Unreal. So notice that we have these categories here. We have an ID. Each individual line has an ID, and it's basically sequential, a number. You have a category and a subcategory. You have a type. You have the actual text. You have duration, follow-up ID. Let me make this a little bit bigger. Active animations, passive animations, and then the audio clips. Same thing we said. When initial NPCs start, notice that they're going to start at the category greeting in generic. And the first NPC will pick a random line from initial, and it will say, how are you? And it'll wait for 3 seconds, and then the next NPC will pick a response from the same category and subcategory. So pick a random response from here, and it can be, I'm fine, I've been better, doing great. Then from there on, we're going to move on to a category, family, and generic, and initial. And then the NPC will say, how's your family doing? Or how's everyone? And then you'll see that there's a response in the same category and subcategory. They're all doing fine, or son got the flu last week. But notice here that right here we have a number under follow-up ID. So if you don't have anything here, then there is no follow-up. But if you specify a follow-up, in this case 15, the system will know that the follow-up will be line ID 15, which is right here. Good to hear. They're all doing fine. Good to hear. Son got the flu last week, 16. I'm sorry to hear, hope he gets better soon. And if you play the showcase level, you'll see the exact same thing here with more follow-ups. So you can change your follow-ups here. This is the example where there's an explosion. Notice that I have showcase and explosion, and it says, did you see that explosion? Yes, my house is gone. Follow up. What are we going to do now? Follow up. Let's ask my brother for help. So you can continue doing follow-ups as much as you want if you want to direct the conversation, and then as soon as it's done, it'll go to the goodbyes at that point, and then it'll say initial and response. Good idea, and let's go. All right. And if we jump to Unreal, I know this is getting a little long, guys. Sorry about that. Go to Blueprints, Core, Data Tables, NPC Dialogue, DT NPC Dialogue. You'll see that this is the exact same thing. Greetings, category, subcategory, family, generic. But here you have additional things. So for example, for how are you, you have the ID, which is 1, category, subcategory, type, the line, the duration, the follow-up ID is -1, means there is no follow-up. But here you can specify the active animations, which by default they're the talk animations, and the passive animations, which are by default idle, and then the audio clips. So when the NPC says a line, the NPC that is saying this line will play the active animations, and the NPC that is listening to this line will play the passive animations. And then under audio clips, you can add as many audio clips, as many takes for this specific line as you want. And in this case, you see that we have audio clip number 1, voice ID male 01, and we have the actual audio clip here. notice that we have an animation montage list that goes with this voice. So that's important to understand. You don't need to have a voice. If you don't have a voice, then the system will use these animations. If you have a voice ID and you're using a voice clip, then it'll use the animations that are here. Notice that if we go to this line, this is also male 1. So I have 2 takes of the same line with different intonation. And then male 2 has the exact same line, but twice. That means that every single voice actor could give you many different takes of the exact same line, and the system will automatically get all of the same lines from the same voice ID and pick a random one. That means, again, depends on how deep you want to go, you can then add a lot of variation on the way each voice actor says the line, and of course, add as many voice actors as you want. All right. Okay. A lot of talk, but hopefully this helped you understand how you can use the the dialogue system, how you can add your own lines. My recommendation is to use the spreadsheet that I showed you guys here, right here. The way you would do this is you would go to File, Download, and then you would use CSV, comma separated values. And if you save the CSV with the exact name as the data table in Unreal, dt_npc_dialogue, if you drag that CSV file into the editor, it will automatically update the data table here. That means though that you will lose values. So a lot of the stuff that you can add on the spreadsheet, like the animations, all of this data will be lost. So do keep that in mind. So it may come to a point that it's probably easier just to add a new row here by clicking here and just adding your information here. If you don't want to lose this data, just keep that in mind. All right, guys. Last thing we want to talk about really quickly is player interactions. I know this is getting long, but I wanted to take some time to explain exactly how things are there. Now let's talk about player interactions. Now this is actually fairly simple. Player interactions in this case refer to the ability for the player to try and talk to the NPC or interact with the NPC in some way. All I'm adding right now is a framework, and it will just simply show a dummy dialogue system or a dummy dialogue that says, hey, this is your dialogue. This is meant for you to add your own system. There are so many different dialogue systems in the marketplace. Even I've seen some free ones online on YouTube, that there's really no point in me trying to reinvent the wheel when having a proper dialogue system is in itself its own asset. So instead, what I did is I made it really easy for you guys to integrate it. So what I'll do here is I'm going to remove this guy because we're not going to be talking anymore. And if I come down to the component controller, I'm going to come back up here to social options, and I'm going to disable. Actually, it doesn't really matter because there won't be any other NPC. Can interact with other NPCs, you can just leave it like that. But notice that we have can interact with player selected. And if we do that and we click play, this guy is just going to go and roam around. And now if we get close to the NPC and press E, notice that the NPC turns to face us. And if we press tab to go into first person mode, it's kind of a little too close. You'll see that he's actually looking at us. And if you move around, you'll see that his head is turning to face us. There's also a sample dialog that says this is a sample dialog box. You can add your own system via the appropriate interface calls. And if you turn around, notice that he's literally just turning to always face you. If you press E again, he'll go back and do his thing. When we are interacting with an NPC, we're actually pausing its routine. And that's important to understand. So I'm going to click on debug routine and press play. And notice now, let's just wait for him to get to its location. Notice that he has a counter there, 297 seconds, 296. If I interact with him, notice that the timer has stopped, and it says here, message, routine paused. So we're actually pausing the routine of the NPC while the NPC talks to us. So keep that in mind. And the reason for that is because if we want the NPC to follow a specific routine, we don't want him to miss that routine or that task because there's a player interaction. So ideally, these interactions are going to be fairly short, so you're not going to mess up their schedule too much. But notice again that he is looking at us and his routine has stopped. If you actually walk away from him and get really far without disengaging, there's a fail-safe system that checks every few seconds, and if the player is not nearby, notice that he resumed normally. Notice that his routine has resumed, and it basically says, hey, you don't want to interact with me anymore. So that's a fail-safe, so you don't forget that you have to disengage. So press E again to disengage, or simply walk away far enough and the NPC will simply disengage. It's that simple. And how are we actually interacting with our NPC? Let's quickly open our player character. So go to Blueprints, Characters, Player, BP Player. Let's just open this guy here. And you can see him right here. There is actually an interface. And if we click on class settings, oops, not here. The player doesn't need to implement it, but the NPC will implement it. Right here. NPC interaction. So all I'm doing is when I overlap my interaction box with another actor, if that actor implements this interface, then I enable the option to interact. And then if I press my interact button, and I can interact because I overlap the actor with that interface, all I'm doing is sending the call interact. That's it. And if we send this simple interface call to the NPC, everything that you saw happen will actually happen. That is pretty much it. And you can see it here. So in your own player character, all you would have to do is copy this section, which is very, very simple, and you'll be interacting with the NPC. Is right here. Event interact with NPC. Is this code right here. Now, if we open the NPC controller, I want to point out something real quick. So go to NPC and open the comp NPC controller. And let's click on event. And let's go into player interaction here. And this is the code that gets called when the player starts interacting. And then all of this you don't need to modify, but here towards the end, see that there is an event called OV started player interaction. OV starts for override, and this code is what you would override to add your own system in the controller, in the comp controller. So you would create a child component, a child blueprint of this component, and then override these functions here. This function specifically started player interaction, and instead of having this called, which all it does is create that dummy dialogue, and then ended player interaction, all it does is remove this dummy dialogue. You would then override this, and you would add your own system. So very, very simple. Use one single interface call and override these two events on a child blueprint of the component, and you can add your own dialogue system with your NPC. All right, that is pretty much it, guys. I think we've covered everything. We looked at the dialogue system, all of the general settings. We again saw how the actual system is designed. We looked at the spreadsheet, and again, grab that link from the description, play around with the spreadsheet, make sure that you save it as a CSV and you give it the exact same name when you upload it to the editor, and it'll update your dialogue. Again, be very careful if you added voice lines or animation clips, because what's going to happen is it'll refresh your data and you can lose a lot of data. So just a little bit of caution there is what I'm saying. And finally, we looked at the player interaction. Again, this is just a framework. The system will automatically pause the routine, have the NPC look at you, but you will need to override those two events. So instead of having a dummy dialogue appear, your actual dialogue system will take over. And all you need to do is call one single interface function. All right, guys, any questions? Again, feel free to reach out to this email below or join our Discord, and feel free to DM me with any questions you have, or simply join. We have an active community. Show us what you're working on, and maybe even ask for help from other community members. All right, guys, thank you so much, and I'll talk to you in the next video.